When I talk to my conservative friends right here, they always tell me that the problem is high taxes, but they're wrong. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is not the high taxes themselves, but the fact that they are not even really funding the government.
That was Nayib Bukele, president of El Salvador, giving a speech at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference. If you didn't know, El Salvador is the first country in the world to recognize Bitcoin as legal tender. And the overarching message of the speech was to advocate for Bitcoin over debt-backed fiat currencies like the US dollar. As a support to the soundness of Bitcoin, which has a fixed supply of 21 million Bitcoins, he was exposing the inherent flaw and existential danger of fiat currencies. They, unlike Bitcoin, have an unlimited supply, and ultimately their value will go to zero. If all of a sudden the ground was littered with diamonds everywhere you went, just strewn with diamonds, would they retain their value? When the president says taxes don't fund the government, and instead it's the printing of money and issuance of debt that does, that's an enormous assertion. And while rhetoric about the national debt is commonplace, it's something that I believe many Americans have become numb to. The problem is we are all frogs in the pot of water that is slowly but steadily increasing in temperature until all of a sudden it's boiling and it's too late. In this video, we're going to unpack President Bukele's assertion and talk about what you need to do to hop out of the pot before it's too late. 1,780,000,000,000. That is the deficit for fiscal year 2025, according to the Treasury's National Deficit webpage. I quote, "A budget deficit occurs when the money going out exceeds the money coming in for a given period of time. On this page, we calculate the deficit by the government's fiscal year. In fiscal year 2025, the federal government spent 7.01 trillion and collected 5.2 trillion, 23 trillion in revenue, resulting in a deficit." Pretty straightforward. Now, bouncing to takeaway number 2, because this is critical for context, quote, "In the last 50 years, the federal government budget has run a surplus 4 times, most recently in 2001, end quote. Translation, the feds are batting 8% over the past 50 years, and they haven't run a surplus in a quarter century. If you had a business with that type of profile, you'd be under heavy scrutiny from the IRS. The US aims to make profit like any business. Shouldn't the same or similar rules apply? Where's the audit? Oh, that's right. The Pentagon is known for failing audits. But moving on to takeaway 3, and this is most consequential to this discussion. And I quote, "To pay for government programs while operating under a deficit, the federal government borrows money by selling US Treasury bonds, bills, and other securities," end quote. And side note, but really important contextual note, do you see this little note on the side of the page? Using multiple terms for the same thing is intended to confuse, distract, and cause apathy as a result. Bookmark that. We're going to come back to it later on in the video. And moving on. When the government spends, the green bar, more than it earns, the blue bar, it makes up the difference by issuing debt. What this means is it creates IOUs and it sells them. The IOUs are called bonds, where the purchaser exchanges currency for the IOU, and the government promises to pay that amount back with interest. The bonds are debt. That is where the term debt financing comes from. A large portion of government programs are paid for or financed by the money that comes in from selling bonds. It's literally the same as you writing, "I owe you $10,000 on a piece of notebook paper." You tell your friend you need money to buy groceries, take care of your grandparents, and repair your driveway. Your friend gives you $10,000 on the condition you pay them back in a specified period of time with interest. For this example, let's say the period of time is 1 year. So then you make regular interest payments for a year, and at the end of the year, you pay your friend back the $10,000. You're in debt to your friend, but you now have capital to take care of your household programs. This is how the US avoids defaulting on its programs like Social Security and Medicaid. But that begs the question.
Who buys the treasury bonds?
And the answer is everybody. Individuals and their brokerage and retirement accounts, countries like China, who is the largest holder of US debt, and the Federal Reserve Bank. And it's the latter that's particularly interesting because of how they buy the bonds. They create money out of thin air, literally. So you have IOUs, which is paper debt backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the US, being purchased by pretend money from the Fed. So vapor bought by vapor. This connects to the president's point where he says,
the real problem is that you pay high taxes only to uphold the illusion that you are funding the government, which you are not. The situation is even worse than it seems, because if most Americans and the rest of the world were to become aware of this farce, confidence in your currency would be lost, the dollar would fall, and the Western civilization with it.
That's the thing. People realize it, they know it, but it hasn't completely registered. And part of the reason why is because the system, which is laughably simple, like the example of the friends from before, seems so overly complicated that most people tire of trying to understand or just tune it out. That's why I side noted the three terms that mean the same thing from before. It's intentional ambiguity. But the president's point is urgent and something I need you to fully digest. The country has basically been in a continuous annual deficit for at least half a century, and they are using literal monopoly money to prop the system up. And the only thing keeping this game going is the fact that people are willing to pretend it's real. That's literally it. The second people refuse to accept the illusion, the second they rip the veil and see who the Wizard of Oz truly is,
I am the great and powerful Wizard of Oz.
the system collapses. At some point, this gigantic bubble will pop and everyone will be forced to accept the reality. But by then, it's going to be too late. If your net worth is tied to fiat currency, it will pop and evaporate just like a real bubble. That's why we call them bubbles. Weimar, Venezuela, Zimbabwe are just some of the fairly recent examples of these type of hyperinflationary events where the fiat currency goes to zero. So while the video of the president is a couple of years old, the message is more critical now because as each day goes by, the national debt increases and we inch closer to the pin that pops this bubble. And the boiling pot, well, that's the tax issue the president mentioned. Remember, he said taxes are high, but they don't actually fund the government. Well, according to the Congressional Budget Office, the average federal tax rate, which includes individual income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate taxes, and excise taxes, has been on a downward trend across almost all income groups since 1979. During that same period of time, spending has increased by any measure you look at it, as a percentage of GDP, adjusted for inflation, whatever. Therefore, if the gap between tax revenue coming in versus spending going out has increased, the president's assertion that taxes don't truly fund the government has some plausibility. As the gap widens, two things happen that inflate this bubble. Number one, more debt is issued to pay for government programs. And number two, more money is printed to buy that debt. The former makes the country financially insolvent, and the latter debases the currency, which also adds to the insolvency and inflates this massive bubble. On top of everything else, as the nominal amount of debt increases, as the government takes on more debt, the amount of interest needing to pay that debt increases as well, which forces the government to borrow more, the Fed to print more to buy that debt, and the cycle just goes around and around and around, which translates into your dollars buying less goods and services over time. The pot is heating up. The bubble can only inflate but so much. If you want to get ahead of getting popped, the solution is to hold your wealth in sound assets that are resistant to debasement. Assets like Bitcoin, gold, and other precious metals, land, artwork, AKA real stuff, not pretend money. And that, in some cases, goes for stocks too. I hope I've made a strong case for you to think critically about your portfolio and how you might want to adjust it. This isn't financial advice. I'm just a guy on the internet trying to save you from financial ruin. If you appreciate this type of human created content, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I try to respond to each and every one, and I really do appreciate the community that we're building, the dialogue that we're having, and the solutions that ultimately are going to come from that. And don't forget too to like, share, and subscribe so that I'll see you on the next video. And until then, be well, be safe. Peace.